Welcome back to Season 6 of the Group Practice Accelerator podcast, brought to you by Polaris Healthcare Partners, where we leverage decades of healthcare and business experience to drive growth in successful group practices just like yours. If you're a healthcare entrepreneur and you're interested in building, scaling, or exiting your group practice, you've found not only the industry's leading resource for business education, but a team of trusted advisors dedicated to helping you achieve and exceed your goals. In short, the team at Polaris creates clarity, confidence, and results. I'm your host, Jamie Falash, and the Group Practice Accelerator podcast is on the air. Hey everyone, thanks for joining me again this week because we're going to talk about something that can sometimes get kind of skipped over when you're building your strategic plan. So we want to take some time to talk about this because it has a big impact on the value of your business, whether you're thinking about selling or not, and really whether you're thinking about exiting in the next year, 10 to 15 years from now. Today's topic is going to affect you, is what I'm trying to say. And it's something that we sometimes hear about docs avoiding, and they're really missing the critical element of valuation, especially when it comes to viewing your business through a buyer's lens. So what am I talking about? Equity, buy-in, earned-in, partnerships for your providers, maybe for your executives, if that fits the size of your organization. Now, you've heard us talk about partnerships many times before on this show, and this is going to be a little different. So I'm going to ask that you stay with me until the end here because something tells me that if you have reasons to not offer equity in your business, that you maybe haven't looked at it from this perspective because it really can be a multiplier. And no, it's not for everyone, but we want to talk about this a little further and we're going to explain that here today. In fact, we are going to give you 6 reasons that partnership increases your value and what considerations you need to be thinking about. And here to field our questions on this and walk us through the perspective that I really want you to grasp as a takeaway is our founder and CEO, Diwakar Sinha. Diwakar, welcome back.
Jamie, thanks for having me back again.
Yeah, good to see you. So we're going to jump right into this topic today because, yes, we've talked a lot about partnership on this show and how that can help with retention and a few other elements with that. But I want to take it from a different perspective today. You know, providing partnership, or let me break that down a little bit. Partnership meaning equity, buy-in, earned in, that type of thing. Equity for your providers and maybe executives. We know through our experience that it can really drive a higher value of your business now and at exit. So I want to start with that. I want to get your thoughts, and then I've got 6 things that I want to go through with you if we can do that.
Yeah, so I think, when people are, as you said, a year or 10 years out from an exit, bringing in shareholders early and the right shareholders on, it's important for the continuity of that business. One, if it's going to be an internal transaction, it allows, if there's already some meaningful shareholders within the business that are minority at some level, allows for internal transaction to happen, a much favorable lending process. But if you're running a process to bring in a third party or strategic or financial sponsor, one of the number one questions we see in a pitch book question is, who are the partners in the business besides the principal, or what percentage of ownership do they have?
Yeah.
And in this transaction, will there be some kind of a waterfall to additional junior doctors or executive team members, depending on the size of the platform that is there? So I think that's becoming more and more common. I think it's been there. I think a lot of people are looking at continuity of care. A lot of businesses that entered that did not think about those issues coming out of 19 or 20 or 21, that are those businesses that are already sponsors are having to work through those challenges today. And when they're potentially thinking of having an exit, and you see more and more larger MSOs and DSOs start to set up a partnership plan because one, they're having those internal same challenges that you might have 2 locations or 10 locations, which is doctor continuity. And two, when they're thinking of their exit process at a larger platform level, they're having to consider those same things.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that we can even take a step back and say that we know plenty of doctors who are successful in their own right and they have not offered partnership. They're still successful. That's okay. Maybe that's been your path. But what we also know is that it does drive, it does motivate, and that becomes a natural progression. So the first question or element that I'd like to talk about is like, how does that drive engagement from partners? How does it drive performance? Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So first of all, when offering equity, I want to offer equity to everyone. I think the the fundamental things that I try to look for is one, above all, a good citizen position. And what I mean by a good citizen is somebody that's just naturally a good person that you would want as a partner within your business. And then if you can kind of say he or she is somebody that I really like and I can see as a partner with my business, doesn't matter if they're 1% or 50%, then that's one fundamental thing. Then I would start looking at and say, okay, are they good clinical producers? If they're in your executive team, depending on the size of your business, can they help elevate my organization to the next level?
Mhm.
So those two things, can they help elevate? And I focus on that is because we get calls about buy-in structures and earn-in structures, and we do both, and we do hybrid models in that. The buy-in structure is great if you are maybe doing one practice every 3 years or 4 years, and you're more of a slow growth business, and most of your practices are at their top capacity. Then I can understand that. But if you're in a growth mode and you're adding locations, then the earning usually in most cases make more sense, especially if you're going to dilute yourself with multiple partners. But when you get to say, what is equity going to get out of provide this business? Assuming you have good shareholders or potential partners in the business, and assuming you have somebody that can help grow and elevate your business, you bring out the best out of them, and you get to extract their full energy and attention towards the business. Now, they're not going to care about the business the same like as you because you're the initial founder and you probably own at least 50% of the business. If not, you might be 100% shareholder of the business. But you're bringing out the best by offering them equity because now you're aligning vision, you're aligning their underlying goals that may or may not have been previously discussed. And when they start to think and act like owners, they start focusing on the culture of the business. They
Mm.
start focusing on team retention. They start focusing on, hey, what are the practice managers doing in each of the practices? Are they in the right seats, right people? What about regional managers and even higher up, depending on the size of the business? And they start focusing on efficiency. Are we being efficient on a daily basis? Are we starting to drive a cost reduction on lab supplies or whatever their cost of goods sold might be, depending on the type of business they're in. So I think it just aligns not just the right doctors to be within your company, but also aligns the efficiency. And if you do all those things, and you have one would think like if you have a business that is becoming more efficient, has lower turnover, has good cultural morale, has good access to care, meaning offering multiple procedures if it's a general dentistry or if it's oral surgery, a lot more specialized care, then it ends up being a business that's naturally, number one, more profitable, and
Mhm.
two, more desirable in the market. I mean, if it makes our job easy when we're creating a pitch book that this team has a lower than average attrition rate of team members. This business is growing at a faster CAGR, which is compounded annual growth rate, than the average business of their peers. This business has a higher EBITDA percentage than their peers. And if we can just show check, check, check on those areas, it naturally ends up being a better process run business for us.
Yeah, it certainly does, and that actually kinda combines the first 2 things that I wanted to ask about was that, what drives performance, but you backed it up to talk about, like, who's on your bench? Who should you be asking? Because certainly this is not a blanket offering. This is people who you have identified in your business or who you would like to recruit to your business that will happily put skin in the game and treat it like it's their own regardless of how much they own. I think that's a critical point to make, so thank you for bringing that up. But let's talk a little bit more about that talent when you're offering ownership. Let's talk about what that can look like and how that does attract and retain the right kind of providers for your business if you know what to look for.
Yeah, I think as more and more doctors are coming out of dental schools, and it might be 1 year out, might be 5 years out, 7 years out, they might be associating somewhere, and we tend to look at these doctors that are potentially moving every 2 3 years, is because they're good doctors, they're doing a decent job, they just haven't found the right home. And
Yeah.
that right home could be due to doctor mentorship, doctor development. That could be based on they feel that they're not going to become a partner in that, or they might be thinking of, okay, I gotta go to an area where I could start up my own business or buy my own practice, right? So I think most of these doctors are looking for some kind of pathway to ownership of something that they feel is part of their process. And so, having a partnership track allows you to go out to the market and say, okay, if you are a good citizen, if you impact our organization culturally, and then as a provider or an executive team members, we have a pathway to partnership for you that allows you to be successful with us, because we want good people with us as we grow our journey, and also aligns their vision. It could be 12 months away from an exit, it could be 5 years or 10 years away from an exit.
Mhm.
Allows them to know that there's a plan for this business, for them to realize their liquidated equity. And what I mean by that is you can offer equity to anyone, or you could have equity for yourself. But if you're not able to exit that business and not able to get a wire across in that business, what is that equity worth?
Right.
So I
Yeah.
so I think it's important to also think about those aspects. It allows people to have a pathway to liquidation at some point for their business.
Yeah, and when you're recruiting people or offering equity to your providers, you're naturally going to be more successful, like you touched on a little bit before. When you're an owner, you're naturally more efficient. You're naturally offering better access to care through your procedure mix. It just overall makes the business more naturally successful and worth more as a result. So, yeah, we've tied all those first three, three together. But I want to move on to something where we get some pushback on this from doctors that really haven't thought about partnership or offering equity and they're resistant to it. So, this is why I want to cover the aspect of control versus influence and why are people so reserved about offering ownership, because we really need to address that before we get to the real advantages of it.
Sure. I think, yeah. So great question. Control and influence is probably one of the number one thing that people are thinking about and might be holding back for a
Mm.
partnership strategy. So I think rightfully so, right? Nobody wants to be voted off the island they created.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
it, so I always tell people what you want within an organization is not control, is influence. If
Mm,
we look at some of our best relationships that we may have out there in business or outside of business, even our personal lives, those are relationships where we have meaningful influence. And that influence, it allows us to have a bilateral process where we're providing influence and we're realizing that influence is having impact on them, and that we are seeing what we're able to impact with those people's lives and grow the business. So influence is very important, and even if you go back to 500 years, 1,000 years in history, the most important people within a monarchy or in history were people that were advisors to kings and queens, not necessarily just a king or queen.
yeah,
Uh, so it's important to kind of think about influence is a lot more impactful. And I think, within that, as, doctors are also trying to figure out, okay, what does dilution look like? And I
yeah,
think control and influence are related to dilution. And when we set up these things, we think about what is the 12-month or 10-year horizon for this business, and thinking about stress testing and saying, okay, how many partners can we bring on board? Where does each partner's equity live? And how is that issued? I was talking to a doctor a couple weeks ago where, they're bringing on a doctor partner for their business, and they're thinking of adding another second doctor, but they're not sure how each doctor's equity position will stack up as we think about the forward years. Well, that's what we're going to do in our process. We're going to lay out a doctor earning equity in 2026 versus a doctor earning equity in 2028. What does that look like for each doctor at each level of entry point? Right. I think that's important in that process. So I always tell people influence is much more important than control. And so let's work on influencing and having that influence within your business.
absolutely. And we talk so much about mentorship on this show too, and what it can do, not just for your business, but the value of your business. So it impacts your patients. It impacts your bottom line at the end of the day. So that mentorship of other providers, even in the form of doctor development, and then leading up to an equity position at some point when it's in your strategic plan, makes all the sense in the world. And secondly, it's a little story for me. I always talk to my son about who you surround yourself with, right? And this speaks to influence. I'm not sure what guru said it. I think I've heard Tony Robbins repeat it before on his show is you are a combination of the 5 people that you surround yourself with. Now, you can surround yourself with people who are just there to collect a paycheck. Fine. If that's the way you want to go that way. But you can surround yourself with people who behave like owners, right? And when you behave like an owner, you consider every aspect of the business and how that's going to grow its people, that's going to grow its value, particularly if you have equity, and how that's going to grow access to care. So, a lot more collaborative. So, I think about it that way. It's who you surround yourself with. And if you have the right combination of people, I think you're really unstoppable at that point. So, that kind of leads me to my fifth question. Like, when should owners start thinking about offering equity or adding partners? Because we know that at exit, this matters. So we want to build it early, but when is early?
Yeah, so I think so. Number one, I always tell people whenever you think about partner, think about it as a recruit and retention tool first.
Mm,
So as you start to see people within your organization that you like, that you feel could be a good people to have within your organization, offer to them before you lose them, right? So I think that's number one. But I think there's also an economic portion to this that I think people need to consider is you need to do this at least 12 months and 1 day before your planned exit. And the reason I say those words is because of potential tax structures of ordinary income
yeah.
versus long-term capital gains. And, if you set up for example, a partnership plan in June of 2026 and you're transacting in July of 2027, then yeah, I mean, you're 12 months and 1 day into that deal and you provide that person a long-term capital gain strategy. This is the recipient, this is the doctor, this is the executive team member that's receiving the
Okay.
equity.
Yeah.
Uh, versus ordinary income, which could be taxed at a much higher rate, 30, 40 plus percent, maybe 50%, depending on some states that are out there, up to 50%. So I think it's important for people to kind of think about how do they want the equity being received to be treated for tax purposes. And again, we work with tax attorneys and CPAs to kind of make sure we structure this in the right way for people. So at least 12 months and 1 day, I think that would be at minimum. And I'll
Oh,
kind of share some math with people and I'll kind of do two spectrums. One, somebody that's at 15, 20 practices potentially, and one, somebody that's 2 to 3. So
okay.
if you're at, grossing 20 to $25 million in revenue, and you want to bring on 5 doctors as partners, and let's say each of those doctors had a goal or potentially bringing on 500,000, let's say, or $750,000 in net equity. If you did ordinary income or you transacted them in an economic waterfall at closing, to net out $750,000, you probably have to give them about $1,200,000 in equity on the
Okay.
business, maybe $1,300,000 depending on the state you live in.
Yeah.
Uh, Versus if you did it 12 months and 1 day before you transacted, to net the same 750 effectively, you would have to give them $1,000,000. So that's
Okay.
approximately 300,000 or $250,000 more per doctor you're waiting to do it at the end. So, 5 doctors, $1.5 million in equity are parting ways with more. And if you're at a smaller practice, let's say you're, looking to give 2 or 3 doctors equity within the business. Let's say you're going to give each doctor $250,000 net to allow them to have. You could have given them $300,000 or 325 in equity and still netted them $250,000 at the closing.
Mm,
Versus if you do it at closing, now you're having to give them $400,000 in equity versus the 325 to just because you waited less than 12 months in 1 day. So that's $75,000 more per doctor. So that's $225,000 more in equity that you're parting ways with just because of timing on 3 doctors. And this is just giving each doctor net 250 at closing to make sure there's a continuity to business and that allows it to grow. So I think it's important for people to think about timing with tax strategy and think about probably their underlying reservations around influence and control and any other aspects of what does dilution look like for me, and am I going to have enough net equity left over after I bring in multiple shareholders, and there's a multitude of questions that people think about. But my always recommendation is 12 months and 1 day before, but at minimum it's probably going to be an issue that comes up at closing in most cases.
yeah. Plan early is what we're trying to say here.
Mhm.
Don't do this last minute. And always, like you said, we work with CPAs and tax attorneys, and we can help you out with that, of course. But speaking of exit, we know that when a business has equity participation, like equity partners, that's way more attractive to buyers. Why is that?
Yeah, I think so. That's the number one. Like I said, I started the process saying that the number one issue that's coming up, as when we run processes is what percentage of owner are the 1 or 2 doctors or 5 doctors within the business. And 9 out of 10 businesses might have only one doctor, so 90+% owner, 100% owner. And then some people might be in a partnership. So the question comes up, but what about the other 5 or 15 doctors or 20 doctors in the business? And again, you're not going to give every doctor equity because, you're looking for the top 20 to 30% to provide equity to help, provide continuity of care to the platform.
Yeah.
So I think whenever they start looking at those things and say, okay, we have a lot of doctor partners in this practice, then they start to feel comfortable about continuity of care. If you have a large enough platform, doing 20 to 25 in revenue, and you start to give executives equity within your business, then it also shows to that platform that, hey, we have executive team members that are going to stay with the business, and I don't have to worry about anybody departing the business. So I have
Mhm.
a little more security within the business. So I think that becomes another important aspect of it. So buyers want continuity of care and continuity of operations within the business, and being able to reflect in that pitch book that we have doctor partners at every one location, every three locations. We have executive team members potentially. I'm not saying do this at one or two locations, but at a larger platform, an executive team member that has equity in the business that allows us to articulate, okay, you're writing a check for 20, 50, $100 million, and you have a team that goes with the business. You don't have to worry about 90-day termination clauses or 120-day termination clauses that people could provide you after the exit, within the business. And as a seller, you will often you have rollover equity. As a seller, you will often have some level of clawback provisions on the performance of the business. So
Right.
if you're not offering that and the deal transacts and you have a disgruntled or many disgruntled doctors that are the top performers often that are leaving as part of that deal afterwards, you could be risking a lot of your rollover equity. And then one last thing, Jamie, that I think a lot of people ask for is, well, like how much equity am I giving up? I would say the guidance I provide most doctors, and this is not an absolute mathematical fact, so I don't want to focus on that. But in most cases, we're typically able to recover the 25 to 50% of the economic dilution, I would call it, let's say, for a growing business in the increased valuation. So if you had parted ways with $1 million in equity through an earned equity program, we're at least going to get you an additional $500,000 in valuation through that process to show you because the market naturally will give you a premium for continuity of care.
Absolutely. And as a founder, if you take yourself out of that role for a moment and look at your organization, I don't care if that's 2 locations or 20, 30, 50 locations, if you look at that from a buyer's lens and you don't have continuity of care from your team, let's say they're not owners and there's a mass exodus after this transaction, look at what that does to the consumer, to the patient walking into your practice. You've got a sea of unfamiliar faces, and there's no security, no retention there. So, not only put yourself in the seat of the buyer, put yourself in the seat of the patient as well. Would you want to continue to go to a place where there's been a massive turnover? Absolutely not. So, that translates directly into the value of your business when you are looking at that from a buyer's lens. There's some security to be had there. And speaking of that, and Diwakar, I certainly don't want to hold you to this, but you're seeing out in the market increases in multiples in terms of businesses that include partnership in their strategic plan and are securing doctors and leaders within their business. Can you briefly touch on that? I don't want to hold your feet to the fire on this.
Yeah, as I was saying in the economic situation of how much we can potentially recover, I would say the smaller businesses are not going to see that much of an uptick where the other businesses, the big larger businesses will.
Mhm.
But in most cases, I would say you're probably going to see a half a turn EBITDA multiple improvement just by having a partnership plan
Okay.
in place.
Yeah, good to know.
So I think that's meaningful, right? So if you have
Yeah,
a $500,000 EBITDA business, that's $250,000 in improved valuation. If you have a $2 million EBITDA business, that's $1 million in improved valuation.
that's
You
meaningful.
need to look at those aspects and say, I'll use a $2 million EBITDA position. If you have a $2 million EBITDA position, you have $1 million in minimum valuation change. You might only be diluting yourself down by $2 million because
Yeah,
a $2 million EBITDA business is let's call it 6 locations, maybe 8 locations, depending on the number of chairs and type of procedure, specialty versus general. So you're not diluting yourself by $5 million or $10 million in that transaction. I think so. I think it's important to kind of think through, you know, what are you giving up in dilution versus what you may realize through an marketed exited process with us.
yeah. And that statement about sums it up. You really have to step back and look at what the potential is. And sure, you can be successful without partnership, but you can also be a lot more successful with it.
Yep.
So thank you, Diwakar. We appreciate your insights here today. I'm just trying to give people something to think about. So maybe this hasn't been on your radar, But, always be open to the prospect of that and really explore it before you decide which way you're going to go. And to all of you, we love your questions, so keep them coming and we'll keep delivering the content that you ask for. As always, if you want to learn about any of our Polaris expert advisory services, or maybe there's a topic that we haven't covered yet that you'd like to hear about, please go ahead and send us an email to info@polarishealthcarepartners.com. And be sure to go over to our website at polarishealthcarepartners.com, where you'll find weekly articles, our blog, along with access to all podcast episodes, our events, and a whole lot more. Thanks so much for being a loyal listener and subscriber. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a colleague and be sure to leave us a rating on any of your favorite podcast platforms. We'll see you on the next episode of the Group Practice Accelerator podcast.